The hidden lives of medieval servants. The forgotten workers of the medieval world. Imagine dawn breaking over a medieval English castle, the grey light creeping into chilly stone halls as a handful of bleary-eyed figures stoke kitchen fires and scatter fresh rushes on the floor. These figures are the household servants, the invisible yet essential workforce that kept noble estates running daily. From pre-dawn until long after dusk, servants toiled behind the scenes, tending to every domestic need of lords and ladies. Chronicles and romances of the Middle Ages celebrated knights and nobles, but rarely mention the maids who scrubbed flagstones or the grooms who fed war horses. Historical documentation about servants is indeed sparse. They left few records of their own, and often appear only as nameless entries in account books or brief notes in letters. Yet, by piecing together household records, court rolls, personal letters, and even literature, modern historians can reconstruct their lives and recognize their significance. For example, the 15th-century letters of the Peasants family preserve snippets of servants' voices. Margaret Peasants dutifully recorded the transient words of her household and estate servants in correspondence to her husband. Such fragments remind us that servants, though largely forgotten by history, were very much present and vital in their own time. Medieval servants truly were the forgotten workers of the medieval world. They served in the shadows of great halls and manor kitchens, seldom noted by name, yet their work made possible the splendid lifestyle of the nobility. Reconstructing their daily existence is an exercise in detective work, combing through royal household ordinances, aristocratic account books, and scattered remarks in chronicles for clues. It is a necessary task, for without these invisible servants, the castles of medieval England could not function. In this overview, we will shine a light on the hidden lives of these men and women, their roles and responsibilities, their daily routines, their place in the social hierarchy, and the challenges and occasional opportunities they faced. In doing so, we give overdue recognition to the servants' indispensable contributions in sustaining noble life, even as we acknowledge the scant evidence that survives of their personal stories. The roles and responsibilities of servants. Medieval noble households were complex operations, and servants filled a wide spectrum of specialized roles. Broadly, their duties fell into three categories: household servants, kitchen staff, and estate workers. Each group required different skills, and each servant, from the highest steward to the lowliest scullion, had a defined place in the lord's domestic machinery. Household servants. These were the attendants responsible for the lord's residence and personal needs. At the top stood officers like the steward, or seneschal, and chamberlain, often of gentle birth and entrusted with great responsibility. The steward acted as the estate manager and chief administrator, overseeing finances, legal affairs, and the coordination of all other staff. A medieval guide to stewardship, seneschalcy, advised that the seneschal of lands ought to be prudent and faithful, and he ought to know the law of the realm, to protect his lord's business and to instruct the bailiffs who are beneath him. The chamberlain, meanwhile, managed the lord's private chambers and wardrobe. He looked after the lord's clothing and even kept track of livery uniforms issued to other servants. For the lady of the household, there might be a lady's maid or gentle-born companion performing equivalent duties, dressing the lady, tending to her chamber, and managing her jewels and linens. Lower-ranking household servants included the laundress, who washed clothing and linens in large tubs of heated water mixed with lye soap, and the chambermaids who swept and tidied rooms, laid fresh rushes on floors, made up beds, emptied chamber pots, and kept the fires lit in the chambers. Young boys of good family might serve as pages. At around 7 years old, a page would be sent to a lord's household to run errands, carry messages, and wait upon the lord at meals. Pages were not paid wages. Instead, their payment was the training in manners and management they received as they observed and assisted the lord, a first step on the path to knighthood for those of noble blood. It's important to note that despite later romantic images of castles teeming with maidservants, most household servants in medieval England were male. Surviving household ordinances show far more men employed than women. Women usually served in gender-specific roles like laundry or as ladies' attendants, and sometimes the wives of male servants worked unofficially alongside their husbands. Kitchen staff. The castle's kitchens were a world unto themselves, staffed by a brigade of servants to prepare the vast quantities of food required by a noble household. At the head of the kitchen was the cook or master chef, responsible for planning menus and overseeing meal preparation. In a great lord's household, the cook supervised a team of undercooks and specialists. There were servants dedicated to butchering meats, baking bread, brewing ale, and making confections. Larger establishments even had niche experts, a sauce maker, a pastry chef, a waferer to bake light wafers for desserts, and so on. Supporting them were countless helpers. Scullions scrubbed pots and pans, spit boys, often small boys, sat by the hearth roasting meat on the spit, and general kitchen boys fetched water and fuel. Two particularly important offices were the butler, who managed the wine and beer in the buttery, and the pantler, who oversaw the pantry with its stores of bread. These officers ensured that drink and bread, staples of every meal, never ran out. Contemporary account books give us an idea of the scale of these operations. For instance, the Royal Constitutio Domus Regis, Household Ordinance of 1136 lists dozens of kitchen servants, from master cooks down to bakers, along with their daily allowances of food and drink. Preparing daily meals for a castle meant coordinating bakers to churn out bread, brewers to make ale, and poultry keepers to supply chickens and eggs. It was the cook's duty to manage all this activity. One medieval cookbook, the Viandir of Tailvant, contains elaborate recipes used by such cooks, including rich meat pies and spice stews, hinting at the expertise these kitchen staff needed to satisfy their lord's palate. In sum, the kitchen servants formed the engine room of the household, turning raw farm produce into hearty meals for dozens or even hundreds of people each day. Estate workers. Beyond the mansion or castle walls, a noble's estate required its own cadre of servants and workers. These individuals might not serve inside the lord's home, but they were part of the extended household in a broad sense, keeping the lord's lands productive. The chief among estate staff was often the bailiff or estate steward, who managed the manor farms, collected rents from tenant farmers, and oversaw agricultural work. Under him toiled ploughmen, oxherds, cowherds, swineherds, and shepherds, who tended the flocks of sheep that could be a major source of manorial income, providing wool, the medieval gold. A later medieval estate management manual by Walter of Henley advised landowners on selecting honest and competent bailiffs and keeping close watch on daily outputs of the domain farm, implying that estate servants had to be both hard-working and trustworthy under distant supervision. On the estate's lands, gardeners and orchard keepers cultivated vegetables, herbs, and fruit for the household's tables. For a large castle, there might be a park keeper or gamekeeper maintaining deer parks for hunting. And of course, there were the stable hands and grooms who cared for the lord's horses. Horses were essential for medieval life, for war, travel, hunting, and transport, so grooms occupied an important niche. They mucked out stalls, brushed and fed the horses, and prepared them for riding or for pulling carts. The castle's marshal oversaw all horse-related operations, and often supervised military readiness as well, with grooms and blacksmiths under him to shoe horses and repair wagons. We even hear of specialized roles like the falconer, trained in handling the lord's hunting hawks, and watchmen or porters who guarded the castle gates. In aristocratic households like that of the Berkeley family or the Peasants, surviving account books note payments to such workers, entries for wages of ploughmen, purchases of fodder by the head groom, or liveries, uniforms, issued to gardeners give us a paper trail of these servants' existence. While these estate workers toiled outdoors rather than in the Great Hall, they were as critical to the lord's comfort as any indoor servant. Their work meant that the household was fed, the grounds kept orderly, and the lord's wealth, tied up in crops and livestock, was maintained. It's clear that nearly every facet of life in a noble household corresponded to a servant's job. From personal attendants who dressed the lord in the morning, to kitchen hands who cooked his supper, to ploughmen who harvested the grain for his bread, a chain of labor supported the lofty lifestyle of the medieval nobility. As one historian aptly put it, a great household was like a microcosm of society, containing its own administrators, artisans, and workers within it. Each servant, high or humble, knew their duties and their place in this hierarchy. In the next installment, we will step into the shoes of a typical servant and follow a day in their life, to see how all these roles came together in practice. A day in the life of a medieval servant. What was it like to be one of these servants, going about your work from sunrise to sunset? To answer that, let us imagine a typical day in an English manor house or castle, seen through the eyes of a servant. In reality, the experiences of a steward versus a scullion would differ greatly, but by combining various accounts we can sketch a general picture of daily routines. Morning, long before the lord and lady stir from their beds, the household servants are up and busy. A castle maid servant is often the first to awaken in the cold pre-dawn. Her day might begin by creeping into the great hall or solar with a lantern to revive the hearth. She sweeps the floors clean of yesterday's rushes, the straw or herbs strewn to keep floors fresh, and, if needed, lays down a new layer of rushes across the flagstones. Next she makes the rounds of the bedchambers, drawing curtains, emptying chamber pots, and carrying out the ashes from the braziers or fireplaces. If the household has a dedicated laundress, soiled bed linens and clothing are bundled off to be washed, otherwise the maid might have to cart heavy buckets of water from the castle well for washing laundry herself. Fetching water was a laborious but daily task. A laundress would haul water and heat it in great cauldrons, scrubbing clothes with strong lye soap that chapped her hands. Meanwhile, in the kitchen before sunrise, the cook's assistants are already at work. They've relit the kitchen fires and set large pots of pottage, a thick porridge stew, to simmer for the servant's own simple breakfast. A scullion boy might be sent to the well or nearby stream to bring in fresh water for cooking and brewing. The baker is kneading dough for the day's bread, and if it's a baking day he will fire the bread ovens at dawn. As the first light filters in, the lord's personal attendants prepare for his awakening. A chamberlain or valet readies a ewer of warm water and towels for washing, lays out the lord's clothing for the day, and prepares to help him dress. Midday, by late morning, the household is in full swing. The lord and lady have perhaps broken their fast on bread, cheese, or ale brought to their chambers by servants, and now everyone braces for the main meal of the day, usually served around midday. In the kitchen, activity reaches a peak. Meat is roasting on the spit, with a dedicated spitboy turning it slowly over the flames. Cooks chop vegetables and mix sauces, following the recipes or their lord's tastes. An aroma of baking bread, stew, and spices fills the air. In a well-organized household, each servant knows his part. Butlers bring up casks of ale and wine from the cool storerooms, pantlers fetch loaves from the pantry, and servers set the trestle tables in the great hall. They cover the tables with clean linen cloths and arrange knives, spoons, trenchers, edible bread plates or wooden boards, and cups. When the food is finally ready, a procession forms to bring it into the hall. This is a moment of pride for the staff, showcasing their work. The marshal of the hall might announce the meal, and servants carry in dishes of meats, pies, and fish in order. During the lord's dinner, the higher-ranking servants perform very visible duties. The carver expertly slices meats at the table, the cupbearer pours wine and presents the cup to the lord on bended knee, and pages bustle around offering dishes or refilling trenchers. In a famous illustration from the early 14th century Luttrell Psalter, we see a great lord dining while attended by servants. A bearded servant presents platters of food, and a kneeling cupbearer hands a drink to the lord. Surrounding them, on the table, lie knives, loaves of bread, bowls of stew, and other dishes, indicating the servant's meticulous preparations. This vibrant scene underscores how servants orchestrated every aspect of a noble meal, from cooking to courteous presentation. Regular household servants ate after the lord. Once the gentry had been served and were busy feasting, the lower servants would take their own meal, often in the kitchen or a side hall. Their fare was simple: coarse bread, pottage or boiled meat from the lord's table, and ale to drink, a far cry from the delicacies their masters enjoyed. One 15th century source notes that everyone except the lord's family and highest guests sat and slept in the great hall, which doubled as the dining room. Thus, after serving the lord, the servants might sit at the lower tables of the same hall to eat their noonday dinner, chattering among themselves but ever attentive in case the lord or lady should call for something. Evening, after the main meal, servants cleared the tables. Scraps from the lord's dinner might be collected, some to be given as alms for the poor at the gate, others set aside for the servants' supper later. The afternoon was a time for continuing chores. A housemaid might spend early afternoon laundering clothes or ironing the lord's garments. If an important day is coming, his doublet and hose must be immaculate, or mending torn fabrics by firelight. The laundresses, having soaked and scrubbed linens all morning, haul the heavy wet load to hang in a breezy courtyard or on hedges to dry. On the estate, outdoor workers use the remaining daylight for farming tasks. A ploughman urges oxen to finish a field, gardeners tend the lord's rose beds or herb garden behind the manor. As dusk approaches, the household prepares for the night. Supper in a medieval household was generally a lighter meal eaten later in the evening, and again servants worked to cook and serve it, though on a lesser scale than the midday feast. After supper, the lord might relax in his solar with wine or engage in conversation, music, or prayers. A few attendants stay on hand to fetch anything required. A chamberlain helps the lord undress and readies his bed, while a lady's maid does the same for the lady, combing her hair and laying out nightclothes. Other servants finish tidying up, cleaning the kitchen utensils, banking the cooking fires safely for the night, and shutting up the storerooms. Before bedtime, the watchmen or porters make their rounds, ensuring doors and gates are barred. Finally comes what little rest the servants get. Most of them slept communally, often right where they worked. A description of castle life notes that most servants and even lower-ranking knights slept in the great hall itself, on pallets or benches around the dying fire. In many households, the male servants bedded down in the hall or in cellar and attic chambers set aside for servants, while female servants might share a small dormitory or sleep near their mistress's room. Privacy was scarce. They were fortunate to have a straw-filled mattress. Many just slept on rushes or a simple blanket. After an exhausting day of hauling water, scrubbing floors, and running up and down staircases, a servant likely collapsed into sleep quickly despite the hard bedding. In a few hours, it would start all over again at the next crack of dawn. It was a life of ceaseless labor and little leisure. Perhaps there were moments of respite, a stolen chat among scullions, a brief pause to enjoy the warmth of the kitchen fire, a holy day festival when work lightened a bit, but for the most part, a servant's day was consumed by service. And yet, there was a rhythm and dignity to it as well. They took pride in their skills, whether it be a cook perfecting a sauce or a maid keeping a noble lady's chambers spotless. The routines of each day, repetitive but essential, made them the unsung backbone of the medieval household. Social hierarchy and servant life. Within a noble household, servants occupied a strict hierarchy of their own, mirroring the feudal hierarchy of the wider world. Not all servants were equal. There was a world of difference between the elegant steward who sat near the high table and the dirty scullion who slept on the kitchen floor. Servants' ranks and duties were sharply defined, and upward mobility, while difficult, was not impossible. At the top were the household officers, those with managerial roles or specialized expertise, often accorded respect and some privileges. The steward or seneschal, as noted, could be a man of considerable standing, sometimes a knight or lesser noble himself, who interacted almost as an equal with the lord. He might dine with the family on occasion or have a private room. The chamberlain, marshal, and head cook also ranked high. They exercised authority over other servants. These upper servants could be rewarded with good salaries, gifts, or even land for loyal service. Many great lords sought educated men for such positions. In fact, by the 13th century there were even training programs for stewards. One source notes an Oxford college that offered 6 to 12-month courses for prospective stewards in accounting, estate law, and letter writing, a medieval business school of sorts to produce competent estate managers. Below them were the yeomanry and gentry servants, people of slightly lower status who nevertheless had important roles. For example, a large household might classify certain trusted servants as yeomen, indicating a middling rank. The yeoman of the pantry or yeoman usher would be above the ordinary servants but below the knights and gentlemen of the household. In some cases, members of the lord's extended family or lower nobility served in honorary domestic roles. For instance, a young noble might serve as the lord's cupbearer or esquire of the body, personal attendant, as a form of apprenticeship in knighthood. These well-born youths were technically servants but carried social prestige due to their birth. A king or great magnate often expected to be attended by the sons of other nobles, lords expected to be served by well-born men and boys, and kings by the offspring of great lords. Service in such cases was as much about patronage and networking as labor. A young squire serving wine at the royal table was learning courtly manners and making connections that could benefit his future career. Lower down the ladder were the ordinary servants, the majority, who did the hard manual work. These included the kitchen maids, scullions, grooms, laundresses, and workers. They addressed the upper servants with deference, using master or mistress as appropriate. Household rulebooks and books of etiquette from the era make clear that every servant was expected to know their place. The Book of Nurture, by John Russell, a 15th-century treatise on good manners for servants, provides insight into this structured environment. John Russell himself had been an usher and marshal in the household of the Duke of Gloucester, and his manual instructs young servants on everything from carving meat properly to how to address superiors with humility. Servants were trained to bow at the correct times, to never turn their back on a lord, and to behave with courtesy and discretion at all times. The very word servant in this context was honorable. It implied loyalty and duty. A well-run household was often remarked upon in terms of its servants' discipline and propriety. One 15th-century poem, the Book of Courtesy, imagines an ideal noble house where every servant, from steward to child page, is orderly, the attendants are tidy, silent and less spoken to, quick to obey, and skilled in their work. Despite the idealized portraits, real life could be messier. In smaller households, servants often had to multitask and overlap duties. A royal ordinance might strictly define the job of a panther versus a butler, but on a modest estate one man might effectively do both jobs. Historian Kate Mettes notes that many servants were jacks of all trades. A groom might also help in the kitchens on busy feast days, or a lady's maid might also nurse the household sick if no physician was available. The hierarchy was thus somewhat fluid at the bottom, though rigid at the top. A scullion could not presume to sit at table with a yeoman, but he might find himself handling tasks beyond scouring pots if necessity demanded. The social world of servants extended beyond work duties. High-ranking servants sometimes formed connections with their masters that blurred social lines. A trusted steward or old nurse might become a confidant to the family. The literature of the period has examples of wise old servants offering counsel. Think of Chaucer's tales or Shakespeare's later medieval set plays, where loyal servants advise rash princes. And in some cases, household service was a pathway, though narrow, to advancement. A page of noble blood was expected to become a knight, but even a common-born servant might rise to become a valet or clerk if he proved exceptionally capable and lucky. We even find instances of nobles rewarding faithful servants by arranging good marriages for them or appointing them to lucrative offices. Within a great lord's affinity, his circle of retainers, a clever servant could leverage patronage to climb the ladder. Still, such success stories were the exception. For most servants, life was bounded by hierarchy. They answered to those above and commanded those below. A kitchen maid might oversee the scullery girl, but herself had to answer to the cook, who answered to the steward, and so on. Everyone had someone to defer to. One interesting aspect of this hierarchy was how it mirrored feudal ideals of loyalty and protection. A servant owed loyalty to their lord, expressed in diligent service. In return, the lord had a paternal duty to provide for the servant food, shelter, wages, and care in illness or old age, at least in theory. A well-known medieval saying was, "Service is no inheritance," meaning that no one is born a servant irrevocably. It was a role one took on, often voluntarily for wages or training. Some servants were indeed born into servile status, especially in early medieval times, if they were serfs, but by the later Middle Ages in England, most domestic servants were technically free people employed by contract. They could leave service and seek a new position elsewhere, though not without challenges, as we'll see. Thus, while servants lived constrained lives, they were not slaves, and their relationship with the master had elements of mutual obligation. This dynamic is encapsulated in manuals like Walter of Henley's Estate Guide and the Household Ordinances of Noble Families, which often exhort lords to be just and fair to their servants, to pay their wages on time, to provide livery clothing at least twice a year, and to not abuse them without cause. Of course, reality could diverge, but the ideal was a sort of family of the household, with the lord at its head and laird ranks beneath. In sum, the domestic staff of a medieval English household formed a miniature society with its aristocrats and commons. Titles like steward, squire, or scullion were not just job descriptions but social identities that dictated how one was addressed and treated. Everyone knew their place, and while a lucky few might improve their station, most lived and died in the role they occupied, loyal to their lords and proud, in their humble way, of the service they gave. Challenges and opportunities. Being a servant in medieval England was demanding, often exhausting work, and it came with many challenges. The hours were long, the labor was physically strenuous, and personal freedoms were limited. Yet, service could also offer a stable livelihood, and in rare cases, a savvy servant might grasp an opportunity for advancement or favor. Let's explore some of the hardships servants endured, as well as the slim silver linings that occasionally shone through. Daily hardships. For the average servant, the most immediate challenge was the sheer volume of work. They typically toiled from dawn until dusk, with very little time off, as one historical summary notes. A servant's day might stretch 12 to 16 hours with only brief pauses to eat meager meals. There was no weekend or concept of overtime. The work was done as long as it was daylight, and sometimes by candlelight beyond. Wages, if paid at all, were low. Room and board were part of the compensation, but those meant sleeping on a pallet in a crowded hall and eating coarse fare. Physical fatigue and injuries were common. Imagine the strain of hauling tubs of water upstairs, or tending giant hearth fires in sweltering kitchens. Servants were also subject to strict discipline. Noble masters expected absolute obedience and maintained order with an iron hand. Household rulebooks and lordly letters reveal that servants could be scolded, fined, or beaten for faults like negligence, theft, or insolence. A mistake as simple as a spilled wine cup at dinner could earn a sharp reprimand or worse. The harsh punishments for any mistakes or disobedience noted in records made servants ever fearful of incurring their master's wrath. Moreover, most servants had little privacy or personal life. They were effectively always on call. A maid sleeping in the lady's antechamber could be awakened at any hour if her mistress needed something. Male valets might sleep outside their lord's door, ready if he stirred in the night. Marriages among servants were sometimes discouraged by masters. A married servant might be seen as less available or likely to leave to raise children. In some cases, servants needed their lord's permission to wed. Those who lived in, the majority in great houses, had to abide by curfews and could not freely come and go from the castle or manor. They lived under the watchful eyes of higher servants who reported any misbehavior. Another major challenge was the social stigma. Servants, especially the lower-ranking ones, occupied an ambivalent social position. They were part of the household, yet decidedly inferior in status. In a rigidly status-conscious society, a servant had to endure snubs and sometimes outright abuse from their betters. A lord or lady in a foul temper might curse their servants or strike them, and the servant had little recourse. The concept of honor that gentlefolk cherished did not extend to servants, who were expected to tolerate humiliation patiently. One can find, in manorial court rolls, cases of servants being punished for insolent words against their masters or mistresses, verbal retorts that landed them in legal trouble. Additionally, plague and sickness hit the servant class hard. They lived in close quarters, and illness in the household would often spread among servants first. During the Black Death years, many servants perished alongside peasants, and those who survived found themselves suddenly in demand and able to ask higher wages, prompting new laws like the Ordinances and Statutes of Labourers, 1349 to 1351, to try to cap their pay. Those laws effectively tied some labourers and servants to their positions, making it illegal to leave employment for better pay elsewhere without permission, under pain of imprisonment. Thus, changing jobs was not always straightforward. A servant couldn't easily quit on a whim. Many had annual contracts or were liveried to a lord, given clothing and pay in advance, obligating them for a year of service. Despite the hardships, service was not without its opportunities and rewards, limited though they were. For one, a position in a wealthy household meant steady food and shelter, something not to be taken for granted in an era of famines and war. A young person from a poor village might actually improve their situation by entering service. They would eat better at a lord's manor than scraping by as a landless labourer. They might also learn valuable skills. A kitchen apprentice could pick up cooking techniques, a chambermaid could learn embroidery or medicinal lore from older servants, a manservant might learn to read or handle accounts if he showed aptitude. Service was sometimes seen as a training ground, especially for youths. The idea of starting as a page and rising to knighthood is one example of an ingrained path of advancement for those of gentle birth. But even for commoners, a bright servant could be promoted from stable boy to head groom, or from kitchen maid to cook's assistant, over the years. Some lords took notice of especially loyal or talented servants and gave them one-time chances, perhaps appointing them as a bailiff of a small manor, or rewarding them with a bit of land or extra pay. In the Pashtun family letters, we find an interesting case. Richard Caillet, the Pashtun's estate steward, essentially a chief servant, so proved his worth that he gained the affection of his master's daughter. In 1469, Richard Caillet actually married Marjorie Pashtun, with her parents initially furious at their daughter marrying below her station. Though a scandal at the time, it illustrates how a servant of low birth could, by merit and some audacity, climb the social ladder, in this case, literally joining the gentry family he served. While such romantic outcomes were rare, it was not unheard of for a servant to accumulate a little wealth or property. A faithful servant might be remembered in a lord's will, receiving a small annuity or a gift of a cow or a bit of land. Particularly in monasteries or in royal service, long-serving personnel could retire with a pension or be looked after in old age. Servants also derived a sense of community and identity from their role. They were part of a great lord's affinity, a source of collective pride. When their lord fared well, they celebrated. When he fell on hard times, they too suffered. There are accounts of servants showing remarkable loyalty, staying to defend a castle even when under attack. Margaret Pashtun's letters describe how in 1448 one of her manor houses, Gresham Castle, came under siege by a rival lord's forces. With her husband away, Margaret and a few members of her household, likely including armed servants and retainers, held out as long as they could. Eventually they were ejected by the besiegers, but her servants had literally put their lives on the line to protect their lady and her property. She wrote urgently to her husband requesting crossbows, poleaxes, and protective jack coats for her household defenders. This dramatic example shows that servants could be caught up in the feuds and warfare of the era, and that in moments of crisis, the line between servant and soldier are blurred. Those tasked with guarding the castle or accompanying the lord to battle shared in the dangers of medieval conflict. Lastly, we should mention the emotional bonds that could form. Living in close quarters, serving a family for years or decades, servants were often intimately involved in their masters' lives. A wet nurse might raise a noble child from birth and be cherished almost like a foster mother. A valet who served a lord from youth to old age might become his confidant and be described as a beloved old servant in chronicles. These personal bonds could give servants a degree of informal influence. A lord might heed advice from a long-time retainer whom he trusted deeply, much to the annoyance of the lord's noble peers, who might sneer about upstart servants. In the royal courts, of course, this dynamic was especially noted. Kings like Edward II and Richard II of England infamously elevated certain personal friends, who technically began as royal household servants, to positions of power, causing political strife. While those are extreme cases, they underscore that favoritism could sometimes bypass rank. A canny servant who won a lord's favor might accumulate gifts, land, or lucrative offices, essentially leveraging personal trust into social capital. For the vast majority of medieval English servants, however, life remained a cycle of hard work with modest recompense. They endured long days, took pride in serving well, and in return gained security and a place in the feudal order. The lucky few climbed higher or won a measure of esteem. The unlucky might be cast off without a reference if they displeased their master. Yet collectively, through good and ill, it was the labor of servants that kept the grand households of medieval England functioning each day. Their challenges were many and their opportunities few, which makes it all the more important to acknowledge their resilience and contribution. Conclusion: the servant's legacy. In the grand tapestry of medieval England, the lords and ladies may have been the shimmering gold thread, but the servants were the sturdy linen beneath, often unseen, yet holding everything together. From the castle's soaring towers down to its drafty kitchens and barns, servants provided the muscle, skill, and day-to-day management that allowed noble life to flourish. They were the ones who lit the fires each morning and doused the lamps at night, quietly enabling every feast, every hunt, every comfortable night's sleep that the upper classes enjoyed. Though overlooked in most chronicles, their contribution was nothing less than the foundation of noble society. The legacy of medieval servants can be measured in several ways. On a practical level, they literally sustained medieval culture. Without servants, knights could not have ridden off to tournaments or war, someone had to care for the horses and armor, nor could ladies have worn those elaborate gowns, someone washed and mended them, nor could castles have projected hospitality and power, someone cooked the banquets and kept the halls clean. The labor of servants shaped medieval society by enabling the leisure and governance activities of the ruling class. In a sense, the chivalric and courtly accomplishments of the Middle Ages rode on the back of servant labor. We see this legacy even in language. Our words service, servant leadership, or service industries ultimately hark back to the roles defined in medieval estates, a reminder that serving others was codified and expected long ago. Culturally, the idea of loyal service became a medieval virtue in itself. A good servant was the prototype of fidelity, humility, and diligence. These ideals filtered into literature. Think of the ever-faithful steward, or the long-suffering nurse, or the clever servant who outwits foes to save his lord. While real life was often less glamorous, the appreciation of good service was genuine. Nobles kept elaborate household ordinances and books of courtesy to ensure their servants upheld high standards. In turn, many servants took pride in being part of a noble house's honor. The reputation of a great family often rested on having a well-run household, which was a credit to its servants. Thus, their legacy is also one of professionalism. The medieval household was arguably the birthplace of organized domestic work and estate management, arts that have evolved but not vanished. For modern historians, reconstructing the lives of these medieval servants has been a bit like excavating a hidden foundation. Scholars such as Kate Mettes and Sive M. Woolgar have painstakingly combed through account rolls, payrolls, and letters to bring these individuals back into the narrative. Each wage entry or mention of a servant in a letter is a small window into their world. We have discovered, for instance, how a 14th-century countess's household was staffed and financed, or how many pairs of shoes a duke's servants wore out in a year. Through such details we gain a richer, more truthful picture of medieval life, one that includes not just kings and battles, but cooks and laundresses and grooms going about their daily business. In acknowledging the servant's legacy, we also gain empathy across time. The basic rhythms of a servant's day, work, worry, occasional satisfaction, meager rest, are not so alien to us. While the social structure has changed, many people today still work in service roles. Understanding medieval servants reminds us how fundamental and historically enduring such work is. It also highlights how far workers' rights have come. The invisible medieval servant has become the modern essential worker, deserving of recognition and fair treatment. History's value lies in these lessons. The servants of medieval England may have been voiceless in their own era, but in studying them we give them a voice and honor their contribution. As we close the great ledger of this imaginary noble household, we can picture for a moment one of those countless servants, perhaps an exhausted young scullion banked by the kitchen hearth, or a grey-haired steward writing accounts by candlelight. Their names are mostly lost, but their collective legacy endures in every castle that stood firm, every grand meal served, every estate kept running in the Middle Ages. The forgotten workers of the medieval world were, in truth, indispensable. By reviving their story, we not only enrich our understanding of the past but also pay tribute to the human effort that underpins history's grand edifices. The castles may have been built of stone, but they were upheld each day by the sweat, skill, and steadfastness of medieval English servants, a legacy as solid as any wall of stone. Thanks for listening. Like, comment, and please subscribe, as that will help us get more videos out to those interested in the Middle Ages. See you next time on Medieval Chronicles 1066. Stay curious.